development. And my hypothesis is that unless there is more coordinated global action to tackle climate change, and soon, it will be increasingly hard to reduce poverty in all its dimensions, particularly in the world's poorest countries. And the costs of adaptation will also rise very steeply. From a development perspective, we see climate change threatening to undermine human development gains, which have been very hard won. And indeed, the impact of severe drought and flooding around the world suggests that it already is undermining those gains. Devastation wrought in this country and the Caribbean by Hurricane Sandy just in the past week plus reminds us just how destructive extreme and volatile weather can be for any society. But on the hope side, out of every problem, I think comes an opportunity. There is significant finance already out there for climate change adaptation and mitigation, and there will be more. And if it's applied to smart strategies, we could, as a global community, if we make this choice, make the transition to greener and more inclusive economies, which will set out simultaneously to tackle inequality, advance development, and arrest ecosystem degradation and decline. We can do these things, and I see huge opportunities in the transition to a green and inclusive economy. I see it as transformational in terms of generating innovation, new products, goods and services, new jobs, new exports. I actually think the transition to the green economy is part of the answer to the lacklustre state that we find the global economy in today. So we have to develop differently, not only developing countries, but the developed world and how it takes its own development forward. My hypothesis is, of course, that this requires many engaged and active citizens, and it requires bold leadership, which is prepared to take on entrenched invested interests and leave behind failed models. The issues and the politics around this are extremely complex and challenging, but it is vital to put aside division and inaction to head off the worst impacts of what we're facing to address the global crime crisis. And I do always stress the importance of cross-sectoral and multidisciplinary approaches. You foster them here at the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment and the program in human biology. Just as fixing health problems is far more than what you do with your hospital system, so fixing the climate crisis is a multidisciplinary, multi-sector endeavour. It requires whole of government and whole of community approaches. We cannot simply relegate these issues to environmentalists and scientists. They can't do it on their own. We have to bring the climate change perspective into debates on how we stimulate our growth, and as I say, I think there's a positive story there. How we address our deficits. You know, one of the tables we thump is about tackling fossil fuel subsidies. If I was a Minister of Finance in a developing country with fossil fuel subsidies taking up 30 to 40% of my budget, which can be the place, I'd be looking at that as an area to tackle, both because it's incentivising things which are harmful to the environment, but also potentially releases funding for better things, including direct targeting of the poor with the cash transfers. So a lot of opportunities to get something good out of what looks like a very, very difficult challenge. So what I wanted to do today was just very briefly discuss ways in which climate change is affecting development. This is a well-informed audience. I don't want to labour the points. Talk a little bit about the disconnection between the scale of the challenge and the seeming slow progress in addressing it. And then look at what can be done and what needs to be done at the next round of the climate talks for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which starts in Doha in the next 2 to 3 weeks' time. So firstly, on the issue of how climate change is affecting development, how it's stalling and how it can reverse with the most impacts, of course, on the people who are the poorest, who have done the least to grow the carbon stock, which we now have, and have the least means to do anything about it. We're talking particularly the low-income countries, and including the small island developing states. Now, it's expensive enough for citizens of developed countries to dig deep into their pockets to adapt to an extremely erratic climate. For poor countries, extremely difficult, accommodating changing weather patterns, crop failure, people literally going hungry, and girls spending less time in school because you have to spend more time walking for water, which is further away, etc. The food insecurity crisis out of very extreme climate events in the Horn of Africa last year and in the Sahel in 2 out of the last 3 years, very serious crises, and we're seeing the effects of extreme climate felt well south of those traditionally dryland areas. I was recently in Malawi about 2 weeks ago, which has enjoyed more food security, but this year, because of failed harvest, around 15% of people will need food relief. The last harvest was rather poor. Back in 2008, UNDP's annual Global Development Report was on climate change, and it estimated that climate change would consign the poorest 40% of the world's population, at that point was about 2.6 billion people, to a future of less opportunity. And it elaborated on 3 ways in which climate change is undermining efforts to reduce extreme poverty. So first and obvious, which I've already alluded to, the effects on agriculture and food production. The IPCC's projections indicate that an increasingly dry and hot climate will make sub-Saharan Africa less suitable for agriculture, reduce the length of the growing seasons, lower the yields, and shrink the revenue. When one goes out to the community level in rural areas in so many African countries now, people say we don't know when to expect the rain anymore. We don't know when it's going to come, we don't know whether it's going to come in one big burst and then not happen again. It's just become less predictable, more erratic. Some predictions are countries seeing their agricultural yields on the current patterns of production drop by about 50% by mid-century. So there's a whole story around what climate change is doing to agriculture, with particular impact on the poorest people. We're likely to see over time built-in consistently higher prices for food. We have experienced very serious food price spikes in the past 5 years. I remember in 2008 I was fighting what was my last election campaign in New Zealand, and New Zealanders were screaming about the